I want to add my greeting and welcome to you this morning on this beautiful Easter morning. It's wonderful to be together and to worship this morning and to celebrate resurrection. During this season of Lent, we have been visiting tables. That is, the tables at which Jesus sat, sometimes with his disciples, sometimes, as Luke's gospel says, quite often, he ate and drank with tax collectors and sinners. He sat at table with many different people, and in this series we've been looking at what happens at the table. Because the experiences at the table have been important ones for those who experienced them originally in the presence of Jesus, and important for us too as we consider what they mean for us today. Today we visit another table, this one in a village called Emmaus. Now it's interesting, we don't know where Emmaus was. There are 3 places now that claim to be the site of the ancient village of Emmaus. So we have no idea where Emmaus was. We don't know, therefore, where the road was that led to Emmaus. And we don't even know the name of one of the disciples who walked to Emmaus on that first Easter day, the day of resurrection that would later come to be called Easter Sunday. It was in the afternoon, and they made their way to this village called Emmaus. Now, the fact that we don't know where the village is, we don't know where the road is, we don't know the name of that other disciple, there's Cleopas and this other disciple, to me is a cue that we ought to place ourselves in the shoes of that other disciple. That we need to remember as we read this that we have walked, or we're walking right now, or we will walk on the road to Emmaus. Because we're human beings. And because every single person in this room has either walked that road, or will walk it, or you're walking it perhaps right now. The road to Emmaus is that dark place. It's a place of grief, a place perhaps of despair, a place where hope has been worn thin. It is a difficult place to walk. The disciples are walking that place on the first Easter, but they have not experienced resurrection. In fact, what they have experienced is the arrest and the mockery of a trial and the abuse and the crucifixion, the death, the burial of their teacher, their friend, their Lord. That's what they've experienced. That's the burden that they're carrying with them on that road to Emmaus. And it's a heavy one to carry. Because the road to Emmaus is a place not only of grief and of loss, but it's the place where hope is strained, if not abandoned, a place of despair. It is a place of fear, a place where the dreams of the future have died, and a place where one does not know what is ahead and how they will keep going. That's the road to Emmaus. As they walk this road, they're talking about all these things that have happened. They are talking about the report of the tomb being empty, but like the other disciples, as it says in the Gospels, they considered this to be an idle tale, that anyone had experienced the risen Christ. Those women who saw the empty tomb, those women who experienced resurrection for themselves and met the resurrected Christ, they just weren't taken seriously. I mean, perhaps it was wishful thinking, the disciples must have thought, because we saw him die. And we saw him buried. And that's the powerful image that was in their minds as they walked the Emmaus road. They were joined by a stranger on the road to Emmaus. We know because Luke tells us that it is the resurrected Christ who joins them on the road, who walks with them, who asks them what they're talking about. And we get some glimpses into their grief. For one thing, they don't even know who he is. They don't recognize the risen Christ. Because on the road to Emmaus, it is hard to recognize the presence of the risen Christ when you're walking that road. It's very difficult. It's not the first time that they've had that experience of not being able to recognize him. When they were on the Sea of Galilee and their boat was being tossed about by a horrendous, frightening storm, and they looked up and this man is walking toward them, they don't recognize that it's Christ. Or Mary, when she goes to the tomb, and when she experiences the risen Christ, she doesn't recognize him. She supposes him, it says, to be the gardener. Because it's hard to recognize the risen Christ when you're in a storm, or when your eyes are filled with the tears of grief, or when you're walking that Emmaus road. Because you feel alone. You feel as though no one else can possibly understand what you're experiencing. The disciples, when they begin to tell the story or say that they're talking about the things that have happened, and this stranger says, "What things?" They're astounded. Because nothing loomed larger in their lives than those things that had happened in Jerusalem. Nothing was heavier for them to carry at that moment, and they could not imagine that anyone else is just going about their business, not even knowing what had happened. Do you know that feeling on the road? When I was 16 years old, my father died. And I remember about a week after the funeral service, everybody just went back to their business. I mean, visitors went home. Family went back to wherever they were from. The cards stopped coming. The flowers were wilted. People went to work. They did their usual kinds of things. And I remember thinking keenly, what is going on? My father has died and everyone is just going about their business as though nothing happened. Do you know that? Do you know that sense? It's one of the Emmaus Road experiences. And it's hard to see that we're not alone. It's hard to see that there are others who walk that road, have walked it, will walk it. It's hard to experience the resurrected Christ with us as we walk that difficult road. And then they come to the village of Emmaus. And they come to the table. And they sit down at the table. And they have invited this stranger to join them there because evening is coming. And they want him to stay with them, extending the gift of hospitality. And as they're sitting at the table, listen to these words. He took the bread, he blessed it, he broke the bread, and he gave it to them. Sound familiar? The words that describe the Last Supper, Jesus' actions there. He took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to them. And immediately their eyes were opened. Because what happens at the table is resurrection. Oh, sure, the resurrection had happened sometime early in the morning, but it had not happened for them. But there, in that village of Emmaus, a place that we all know, even though we don't know where it is, we all know that place. At the table, in the breaking of the bread, they recognized the risen Christ. And that was resurrection, not just in the abstract, but for them. A powerful moment. Viktor Frankl, in one of his books, talks about being a prisoner in a concentration camp and being given one day by a foreman in the camp a piece of bread. The foreman had clearly kept the bread from his own rations from breakfast, and he gave this little piece of bread to Viktor Frankl, and Viktor wept. He said that he cried those tears not because of the little piece of bread, but he cried those tears because something in the look of the eye and the words of the man who gave him the little piece of bread, he recognized in that human something, he wrote. A human something. And it was a turning point for him. Just when he was at the point of despair, just when that road that he walked seemed darkest, there was in the gift of that piece of bread a human something. And not just in the bread, but in the look of the eye and in the words that the giver spoke. It's that way for us on the Emmaus Road. Sometimes someone comes to us with a word, with a look, with a little piece of bread, with a human something, in fact, a divine something, where we realize we're not alone in that, where we realize that the risen Christ is with us, that death doesn't have the final word, that pain doesn't have the final word, that evil does not have the final word, despair does not have the final word. Those disciples were so caught up in despair that they didn't recognize the risen Christ with them. They were so caught up in hopelessness that they were using the word hope even in the past tense. Did you notice? We had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. Words spoken in the first 2 chapters of Luke, that word redeem, the only other 2 places that word is used in Luke's gospel. Luke is saying that this one who is born will be the one who will redeem Israel. But here on the road to Emmaus, it's the past tense. We had hoped that he would be the one to redeem it. But at the table, resurrection happened. The restoration of hope happened. That human something, that divine something that transformed them and gave them hope. Now, for those disciples, they went on their way after that. In fact, they returned to Jerusalem. That table was a stopping place for them. It was a place to be refreshed and nourished. It was a place to be reminded they weren't alone. It was a place to be reminded of resurrection. I remember 2 years ago on Easter Sunday, we had a wonderful lunch together as a family, extended family there. We were laughing and we were talking and the phone rang and it was my brother. And he called to tell me some terrible news. We started walking the Emmaus Road at that moment on that Easter afternoon. It became Emmaus Road for us. My other brother had not shown up for worship that Easter morning, and so my brother went to his house and found him dead. And we started on that road, that difficult road to walk. You know the road I'm talking about. After the worship service celebrating his life and our faith at our little home church, we went into the fellowship hall, and you know what we found there, don't you? Food, lots of it. tables spread with food that people who loved us and cared for us had prepared with the labor of their own hands, and they brought their best. You know, so-and-so's famous recipe, the one that everybody shows up for church dinners to taste. In that meal, there was for us a human something, a divine something that reminded us we weren't alone on the Emmaus Road, reminded us of resurrection, and was a kind of foretaste of a banquet yet to come. Well, for us, it was a stopping place along the way. It was a place to sit at the table. It was a place to experience and be renewed with the good news of resurrection and new life, the presence of the risen Christ. But someday, every one of us will walk the Emmaus Road, and we'll walk it for the last time. And we wonder perhaps what it is that waits for us at the end of that road. It's a question that we ask, isn't it? So I thought about that this week. I thought about an episode of the television show MASH. You remember MASH was a mobile medical unit during the Korean War. The doctors at that unit managed to cope primarily with humor with the terrible things they saw and experienced and saw others experience. Major Winchester managed to cope by keeping himself aloof and above everyone else in some way. But he had always been dogged by this question: what lies at the end? He had managed to keep himself kind of apart from the fray and above it all until in this episode he breaks. He loses it. He can't put off that question anymore, and so he goes to a medical unit at the front. The Colonel Potter, is furious. He calls on the radio to that unit, looking for him and demanding that he come home. He didn't have permission to go there, and he needed him at the MASH unit. And in the middle of that conversation, a young medic runs over to him and says, "He's dying, doctor, come quickly." And so Major Winchester went to the side of a young man who he ascertained very quickly was indeed dying. And desperate to know what is at the end of the road, he said, "What do you see? What are you experiencing?" And the young man said, it's dark. I see darkness. Hold my hand." And so Major Winchester, in a really uncharacteristic way, grasped the young man's hand and he holds it. And he leans over and he has desperation in his voice when he says, where no one else can hear, "Tell me what you are experiencing. What are you seeing? What are you experiencing right now?" And all the young man says is, "I smell bread. I smell bread." If Winchester had only known, he might have gotten his answer. I smell bread. Because at the end of that last Emmaus road that we walk is a table. It is the table that we call in our communion service the heavenly banquet. That image of a table around which people are gathered to break bread. around which they are gathered to enjoy the company of one another and fellowship, and to be in the presence of God, and to experience, in a way like never before, resurrection. Because what happens at the table is resurrection. Now that's the good news we celebrate this morning. It's the good news we sing about. It's the reason for the full orchestra and the choir and all that we are doing is celebrating and experiencing a little bit ahead of time that heavenly banquet, the table of resurrection. May we go from this place today just being able to discern the smell of bread in the air, so that we know whatever road we're walking, there is a table at the end of the road. Amen.